I am happy to introduce Sandy. This is her second year at the Growing Place. She is a very knowledgeable vegetable garden expert, and she's also raised veggie gardens in her spare time and is one of the founders, I would say, of the school garden at Elmwood School. So she's a passionate veggie garden person. So I'm going to get the presentation started and go right ahead, Sandy.
Thanks, Becca. Hi, everyone. So I hope after today, you guys will feel confident about starting a vegetable garden in your home. And like Becca said, feel free to ask any questions along the way. And we'll just go ahead and get started with just overall different types of vegetable gardens, vegetable garden systems that you can have. If you want to go to the next slide, Becca. So kind of a traditional system, you will see, rows of plants, and this typically requires clearing out a large space for rows of vegetables with amended soil and paths for walking. This is a great option. It's inexpensive if you already are starting with good soil. There is definitely less watering to be done compared to other systems, but you will tend to have more weeding to maintain and more pest control to maintain with this type of vegetable system. So let's go to the next one. Another option, it's similar to a traditional vegetable garden system, but you don't necessarily have to clear out a large space for it, because you're kind of creating mounds for your rows. And it kind of involves a composting system where you're going to be layering those rows with different browns and greens, so leaves and grass clippings, and then you'll top that off with soil and plant directly into those mounds. If you have more compacted soil, this might not be a good option, only because you might have some drainage issues with that. But this is definitely another way to do an inexpensive type of vegetable garden without having to build structures. Another type of vegetable garden system is a permaculture. And so this is kind of the idea of like a food forest, where it's more like an edible landscaping, where you're using trees and shrubs that are all used to provide food. And it also can minimize the use of chemicals by incorporating beneficial insects and companion planting, and developing a healthy soil system. It also kind of incorporates the use of compost bins and vermiculture, wormeries, water collection systems, kind of creating a self-sustainable type of landscape gardening. It is a little bit more labor intensive, and it can take time to develop, especially if you're buying trees and things like that take time to develop and produce the fruit that you're wanting to get from them. And then the last type of vegetable garden system are raised beds and containers. I am particularly a fan of this type of gardening system. It definitely reduces the weed and pest control, which always seems to be a challenge when working with vegetable gardens. It also gives the ability for, being handicap accessible, or if, you got a bad back, you don't have to bend over as much. It's great for small spaces. The one downside is that, building materials, and all the soil that you would need can make it a little bit more costly for the setup, but I think in the long run, it's a lot easier to maintain. So once you've decided what type of system you want to use, you'll want to think about where you're going to place this garden. Some of the things to consider is the directional placement. Usually south facing is the best placement for your garden. It'll get the most sun exposure. It tends to be a little bit warmer. You also want to consider any nearby structures and trees, any hard surfaces that could potentially shade the garden throughout the day. There's also microclimates that happen in every yard. So you want to make sure you have an idea of, does this area get really windy? Does it tend to be more cold? So you want to think about those things when you are deciding where to put your garden. Another thing too is it visible to you? I feel like sometimes if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So I think having some place where you're going to see it every day is always a good thing too. Just kind of reminds you to go out and check what's ready to harvest, or what needs watering, or you know, what needs pruning back and things like that. Another thing to consider is also the hours of sunlight that it's going to get. And you know, plants have different needs. So depending on what you want to plant, if your area gets mostly shade, then you're going to need to make sure that the plants that you plant are going to do well with shade. A lot of the annuals for vegetables do require more sun. So something that has at least 6 hours of sunlight is going to be probably the best option for the things like tomatoes and peppers that you want to plant. Another thing to consider is also the accessibility to water. So you don't want to make more work for yourself, because you have to drag a hose or heavy watering cans, you know, to the back part of your yard. So if you can make it accessible to water, that's always something to consider when you are trying to figure out where to put your garden. And the third thing you want to consider is the slope of your yard, because you don't want to put a garden in a low spot of your yard where water can, you know, accumulate there. And there you can have, you know, especially in early spring and late fall, you know, those areas where they get wet can be prone to frost pockets and things like that. That could be a challenge for some of those early and late season crops. So once you kind of have an idea of where you want your garden to go, the next thing that you would want to do is, especially this is more so if you are planning to do more of a traditional garden in the ground, is you're going to want to test your soil. So there's a lot of different things that you'd want to do to test your soil. The ideal soil type is a loomy soil. You can test this by a squeeze test. Make sure you're doing this when it's not really wet. You don't want to do it right after a rain, but it's helpful if it's damp, but not, you know, too wet. If you just take a handful of the soil that you have where you want to put your garden, if you squeeze it in your hand and it falls apart right away, that's a sign that there might be a lot of sand in your soil. If you squeeze the soil and it stays in a clump, then that's kind of a sign that you might have a lot of clay in your soil. If you clamp it in your hand and then you poke it with your finger and it tends to just fall apart after you poke it, that's a good sign that you have loomy soil. And when you know what type of soil you're dealing with, it will help you determine better what kind of amendments you need to put into the soil to make it ideal for the plants that you want to plant. Another thing that you want to test is how well the soil drains. So for this, one of the things you can do is you can dig like a 6-inch hole about 1 foot deep in the area that you want to plant. And then fill that with water and then let it drain out completely, and then fill it again. And if it takes more than 4 hours for that water to drain, then it's a sign that you probably don't have good drainage in the soil, and that could be a problem for some of your plants that need that good drainage with their roots. So that's another thing you're going to want to look for. Another thing is looking for earthworms. If you just dig out a portion, like 1 cubic foot area, and you're finding at least 10 earthworms in that area, that's a sign of healthy soil. Earthworms tend to need more organic matter in the soil, and so this is a great way to find out if there's a lot of good, healthy organic matter in your soil. Another way to test your soil is a pH test. Soil that's too acidic or too alkaline will affect the health of your plants. So typically you want to aim for something that's more of a neutral pH. There are meters and test kits that you can purchase. And then, always adding compost to your soil is a great way to neutralize your soil as well. And lastly, I always advise that if you are planting in your ground, you would want to get a soil test done, and you can do this through the Illinois Extension Office. And they can tell you exactly what nutrients are in your soil, if it's too acidic as well. And this is a great way, especially if there's any toxins in your soil, you want to make sure that you know exactly what's in your soil before you start planting it. So once you have determined that, for if you're going to plant in the ground, if you are planting in a raised bed, or if you're looking to amend the soil that you have, you can make your own garden soil. This is typically a recipe that I advise. You don't want to do more than 1/3 of your soil as compost. So I typically suggest like 30% compost mixed in with topsoil. And then you're also going to want to add some vermiculite, which this especially helps with retaining moisture, especially in raised beds. They can tend to get dried out pretty quickly. So the vermiculite definitely helps to retain the moisture. It also helps retain nutrients in the soil for the plants. And then you also would want to add some perlite to it, because this is going to help keep the soil aerated and allow for good drainage. This is particularly good for if you're planting root crops and things like that. You'll have a much more success if it's light and airy and it doesn't have a lot of compacted soil to have to try to push through. Some of the other things that I always suggest to help create healthy soil is adding some worm castings. As we said, worms are a really good indicator of healthy soil, and these worm castings are part of what add to the health of the soil. So you can use this mixed into the area where you're planting. You can mix it into, if you're planting seeds, you can mix it in, you can top dress, putting it around the plants. And this is always something that I recommend to add. It's kind of as like a natural fertilizer to the soil. Another type of amendment that you can add to the soil, we call them macronutrients. So in a lot of the fertilizers that you're going to see, it has these 3-digit numbers, and that is the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the NPK value of those fertilizers. And these are all the major nutrients that your plants will need to stay healthy. So I know here at the growing place, we've got Biotone, which has that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, But in addition to that, it also has mycorrhiza, which is very beneficial to the growth of your plants. It adds beneficial bacteria to the soil that really help improve the soil health and is beneficial to the plants. There's also a garden tone, which is just a general fertilizer that's great to add to the soil, provides those macronutrients to the plants that they need. And then another one that we sell is the tomato tone, which is also those 3 major components, in addition to some extra calcium, which tomatoes tend to be heavy feeders on calcium. So having that extra calcium will help with the health of your tomato plants in particular. And basically, the reason we want to add these things to the soil is because like the nitrogen is going to help with your plant's foliage growth. And then the phosphorus is going to help with the root development, and the potassium pretty much helps with the overall health of the plant and vigor of the plant. So all of those things are essential to providing your plant with all of the nutrients that it needs. And then the calcium is what helps with the tomatoes in particular, taking in those nutrients as well. And then lastly, there are micronutrients, which are the trace minerals that they're in much smaller amounts. But a lot of times, if you are using vermiculite and worm castings and compost mix, you're going to find those trace minerals in those things already. So that will be adding to the health of your soil. Yeah.
Can I jump in with a couple of questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, so vermiculite and perlite, it's safe for growing herbs and vegetables, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're agricultural based elements that you can use for plants.
I also had a question about the sustainability of vermiculite, and that's something I would have to do some research on, unless you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's used, I think it is used from rocks. Same with perlite. They come from rocks. An option of vermiculite is pine fines. That's another thing that we have here that you could use to help retain the moisture in the soil. I don't know, I'm not sure about vermiculites, I'm not sure of those details, but I know a lot of organic agricultural people use vermiculite for their gardening.
And then for the worm castings, do you have a percentage or just like kind of a general guideline of how much to add?
This can just be kind of worked into the top inch of the soil. It doesn't have to be quite as large of the amounts that the vermiculite and perlite are. It's kind of like you're using it as a fertilizer. But what's great about the worm castings is that it's like a natural fertilizer, so you don't have to worry about it burning the plants like some other like synthetic fertilizers might do.
Okay, more questions for you real quick.
Yeah.
I'll just say all of the Espoma tone products are certified organic. So
yeah.
Biotone, Garden Tone, Tomato Tone, all organic.
Yeah.
And do you have to add every year to your garden bed all of this?
No. Now some of these, like the vermiculite and perlite, won't break down like the compost is. So I usually recommend, adding some more compost every year, just to top off the nutrients each year, because some of that compost will break down. And so you'll find that it will decompose and you'll need to add a little bit more each year. But the other things, the worm castings and the other macronutrients, you would want to add every year, because once you've gone through a growing season, those plants will, they may have depleted those nutrients, and you'll want to add those back in each year when you plant. And you can add them throughout the growing season as well.
Okay, and then I don't think there's any pre-mixed stuff. We don't carry any pre-mix, so you would have all of these ingredients to add. I don't know off the top of my head if there's something that has it already contained in one product.
Yeah, this is more, it's kind of a compilation of things that help create a healthy soil mix.
Okay, and then I have, I think, a couple more questions about soil and raised beds. So
yeah,
if the raised bed is over a barrier, is it okay to add earthworms because they can get warm?
I mean, I always tell my kids if they find earthworms to add them to the garden, because it's a great, yeah, you can just add them to it for sure. They definitely will help. I mean, they will find their way there too eventually, but if you're, you know, if you're finding them, you can certainly add them to it. You can, I mean, they're definitely beneficial to add to the soil.
Okay. The question about the Miracle-Gro raised bed mix. My personal opinion is that it's better to make your own mix, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts, Sandy.
Yeah, I personally, I would encourage, actually, if you can start a home compost, like I think that's a great way to not only save yourself some money, but also you're reducing waste. But I would say, you know, using the compost mix that we have here, or if you decide to start your own home compost, those are probably the best options to use for your garden bed.
Okay, and then leaving your leaves on the flower beds, that's okay. That is definitely okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For overwintering, I always use my leaves to kind of, it adds again to the nutrients of the soil because it can break down. It also kind of protects from erosion and things like that. So I would definitely add that at the end of the season. You can certainly do that.
And then how do you get your compost started?
So compost is kind of a little bit of a lesson in chemistry, because you need the right mix of nitrogen and carbon. And so you've got, you could start easily with just leaves and grass clippings. So you've got leaves would be your browns, and the grass clippings would be your greens. And even if you've got some coffee filters, you know, coffee grounds, you could add that. Eggshells, you can add that. It's just trying to get the right mix of, usually you want like a 1-to-1 ratio, although browns tend to weigh less. So sometimes having a little bit more brown to green is better to get that decomposition going. And, you know, it's important to, it's a living organism in a way. So it's important to make sure it's getting water, and it's important to turn it every few days to get that breakdown of materials to happen. But just starting with like basic, you know, eggshells, coffee grounds, any, you know, if you're cutting up, you know, peppers, you know, any ends of like carrots and things like that, you can, you know, or if you're, you know, like taking the skin off of any kind of fruit, then you can use that in there as well. So just start small, and you know, see where you go. Usually it's recommended that a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot cube is a great dimension to start with. I've used pallets from the growing place to make mine. So that's they sell them at the end of the season. So it's a great way to get started if you're looking to get started with your own compost system. Great. Just make sure that, what's that?
Oh, I was gonna say thanks, Sandy, and I was gonna get you on to the next slide.
Okay. So once you've got your soil prepped and you know where your garden's gonna go, before you start planting anything, it's really important to know what our frost dates are in this area. And it's based on probability levels. So what kind of risk taker are you is basically what that kind of means. If you don't want to have to be running out, you know, every other week because we've got a frost coming to cover your plants and protect them, then you might want to wait until there's a less probability of frost before you put those tender annuals, tender vegetables out. So like for our area, the last frost date, if you're kind of looking for the average, it would be May 6th. However, you know, if you wanted to wait a couple more weeks until you had like, there's like even less likely of a chance of a frost, you could wait till the end of May to put those more tender vegetables out. Same with the first frost date. This is important if you're going to do maybe a second round of some of those fast growing vegetables, so that you have a fall season crop as well. So like things like lettuces, they're great for the early spring, but you can also have another crop for the late fall. And they're pretty fast growing, so you can harvest them, but it's good to work backwards then from that date to know when you want to start planting those seeds for that fall harvest. So that's definitely something to know when we start talking about the plants and when you want to plant them, when they need to go out in the garden, because a lot of times your seed packets will also tell you when you need to plant those particular items according to the frost date. Thanks, Becca. So when it comes to planting, you've got cold loving plants versus heat loving plants. And I always recommend to people that when you're trying to think about what you want to plant, think about what you like to eat. Obviously, you want to plant things that you like to eat. So you'll see on the seed packets, they'll kind of tell you how many weeks before the last frost date. Things that are very hardy, you can usually plant 6 weeks before the last frost date. As opposed to those more tender and heat loving plants, those you need to wait until the last frost date or even a couple weeks after the last frost date. And then you also want to consider, you know, your shade versus sun. There's kind of a little rule of thumb, you know, vegetables that are grown for their roots and fruits typically need full sun, which is, you know, at least 6 hours. Beets are one exception where they actually do okay with a little more shade. And then vegetables that are grown for their leaves, stems, or buds do well if they do get some shade throughout the day. So that's kind of a little tip that I like to tell people as far as how to know how much sun exposure it needs. So I want to talk a little bit about direct sowing versus transplanting. So if you guys got a seed starting kit, you'll see on the back it has the information, and all seed packets have all the information you really need to know about planting those seeds. And it will tell you the recommended, you know, whether it should be sown directly into the soil and by, you know, what time of frost date versus whether it should be transplanted, which means it should be sown indoors at least, you know, a lot of times, depending on the plant, it could be 6 to 12 weeks sometimes, depending on how, you know, slow of a start seed they are. Most of the tomatoes and peppers are usually around 6 to 8 weeks. So this kind of gives you an idea of There will be some seeds that you can directly sow into the ground. And then there are some that you're going to have to start indoors, or you can buy them. You know, we sell a lot of the ones that require transplanting here. So that if you don't want to start seeds indoors, you can get those plants when it's appropriate to transplant them outside. So once you kind of have an idea of what you want to plant, it's a good idea to kind of create a garden layout, just so you have a plan and something to even reference for next year as to where you had everything, what you planted and where it was planted. And so this is an example. The picture here is kind of a square foot gardening method, where every square foot is a different plant, or you could plant a different plant in each square foot. This is a great way to maximize production in a small space. But one thing you want to make sure is you want to allow room for mature growth and airflow. That will help prevent disease and pests. You also want to think strategically about the placement of each of these things within your garden, because you don't, depending on how the sun is traveling throughout the day on your garden, you don't want taller plants to be shading other plants once it's mature, if those plants need full sun. So you need to kind of think about strategically how those things are going to be affecting the growth of the plant, and make sure that you're not shading something that needs full sun, and based on the height and how it will be when it's full grown. And then I would say also with this square foot gardening method, you know, you can kind of, there's a lot of information online as far as what the appropriate space is needed for each plant when using square foot gardening. But typically, you know, those smaller plants like radishes, you can do 16 within one, you know, square foot area, as opposed to, you know, if you're going to do a vining plant like a melon of some kind or pumpkin, then you're going to need like probably at least, you know, 4 square feet of that, unless you need more, because it can vine over to the edge as well. But you're going to want to, depending on the plant, you're going to need to allow different amount of space in each of those square feet. And then something else to consider is companion planting. So this kind of concept is used in that permaculture design, but it's also used a lot with raised bed gardening. And it kind of is the concept of using combinations of plants that mutually benefit each other, or they complement each other in soil nutrient needs and pest deterrent properties. This is a way to improve the soil health as well, because if you're planting the same crop in a large space that all require the same nutrients, it's depleting the soil of that nutrient. So by mixing things around so that you have different crops next to each other that complement each other, this is a great way to do that. So it also incorporates the idea of attracting pollinators by using flowers. Things like nasturtium or cosmos or marigolds are always, borage is another great one that is a great one to attract pollinators. The idea is kind of you're letting nature do the work. A lot of times incorporating fragrant herbs is a great pest deterrent for other plants. So in mixing all of those things together, it kind of reduces the work that you need to do to manage your garden. The example I have here is it's the 3 sisters. So you've got in the center, you've got the corn, and then around it, you've got the beans which the beans, these are like a pole bean. So they are a climbing plant. So the corn provides the structure for the bean plant to climb on. And then the beans also, they're able to transfer nitrogen into the soil, which is what corn is, a very heavy feeder of nitrogen. So that way they're complementing each other in the nutrients that they need. And then on the corners, there is like a squash or some sort of melon plant. And those, they tend to spread out. So they're kind of covering the ground. They're retaining the moisture in the soil and kind of smothering out any weeds that could be popping up too. So this is how the companion planting concept kind of works in this one example. I think on the next slide, this is probably one of the most expansive charts I've seen on companion planting. You can look up on the internet to find lots of different information about good plants that are planted together, but this is great because it even talks about beneficial insects and things like that. And on the top, there is the link to where you can find this chart. And basically the circles are saying these two work really well together. The X's on the chart are saying, don't put these two together because you might not get good results from that. And then the parts that are just kind of blank is it's neutral. There isn't a benefit, but there isn't, you know, a deterrent to want to plant them together. So this is probably one of the most extensive charts I found on companion planting. So I wanted to share that with you guys.
Sandy, I have a couple of questions I wanted to shoot your way.
Yeah.
Does it matter which plants get planted together, like eggplants and tomatoes or peppers with cucumbers?
So you can plant tomatoes and eggplants and peppers together. They're all part of the same family. So usually, you know, plants that are part of the same family, they're not detrimental to plant next to each other, but a lot of those plants might require the same nutrients. So it's always good to kind of mix in different plants with each other. With cucumbers, I would say, you know, there's a lot of, you'll want to make sure with cucumbers, a lot of them they're vining. So you want to have, you know, a support for those so that they're not spreading out and smothering other plants around it. It's a way to maximize the space in your garden. But like for tomatoes, a lot of times, you know, you can plant basil with tomatoes, even carrots with tomatoes. You know, there's a lot of different options that you can intermix in there. It's just a matter of what you want to plant. And, you know, this chart is a great reference tool to, you know, kind of guide your planting and how you want to arrange your garden.
A question about flowers that are good to attract pollinators.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have any specific favorites. And people have been mentioning coneflower and bee balm. Salvias are a good one.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, the hummingbirds love the salvia. Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of the ones that I like to use, the nasturtium is great because not only is it attract pollinators, but it's also an edible plant. So you can, the flowers are edible. A lot of people, you can use them in salads and things like that. Borage is another, like there are always tons of bees and butterflies that are attracted to the borage. And you can even make teas and things like that with the borage. You know, cosmos is another popular one. And then marigolds, they can be, you know, another complement to attract pollinators. Those would be kind of my top ones.
Okay, and then do you have any recommendations for container-sized plants, or what ones are not great in containers?
Well, I know like we sell, I think, or at least we did last year, like the potato bins. Do we have those this year too?
Yeah, we'll have the potato bins. Yes.
Yeah. So those are great. A great way to kind of, those are great for container gardening. You know, lettuces are great. If you're going to do something larger, like a tomato plant, we do have more like compact sizes that would be better for a smaller container. Like I think there's the patio variety and things like that. So like some of the tomatoes, I think it's important to note, all of the tomato plants in particular, they will, they have a indeterminate and determinate, and there's a difference between the two. And the indeterminate they just continue growing. So they're going to need much taller supports because they will keep growing, and they will, they can get quite tall. And then the determinate ones, they tend to stop at a certain, you know, height. So that's something that you want to kind of consider when you're looking, like look either if you're doing it from seed and starting indoors, or if you're coming here to buy, you know, those plants, make sure you're looking at, is it an indeterminate, is it a determinate, and what kind of plant support do I need for that, and do I have the space for that? Because that will affect, you know, the size of the plant will affect, you know, the other plants that you have around it and the space that you have.
Yeah, things like pumpkins and zucchinis are probably too big for containers.
Yeah. Things that are vining, you know, those plants probably won't do as well in containers. The smaller things are great to do in containers, but we do have some variety, like even peppers, they don't get terribly big, so you could do that in a container too. You just have to look at what the mature growth is, you know, when you're determining, you know, the size and what can be accommodated. But I love doing like lettuces and things like that. You can even, you know, as it gets hotter, like if you've got it on wheels, you can kind of move it around so you can give it more shade during the day when it's starting to get hot. Those are some, you know, nice things to have in containers that you can kind of move around and keep, you know, help extend the season for that particular variety.
I have another question about gardening tarp and using it to control weeds. And I would say we do not recommend using any sort of tarp to do that.
No, because that's going to affect the drainage. You know, I would say if you're doing something in ground, you know, you can use like straw or any kind of, you know, bark mulch to prevent weeds. In a raised bed garden, your weed control is kind of eliminated in that sense because it's raised up off the ground, so you don't have as many issues. If you're doing a raised bed, if you want to add an extra layer of protection, you know, underneath, you could, like, if you have an open bottom of the, you know, container, you can put cardboard down to kind of smother the area underneath where you're putting your raised bed. And then that will eventually break down and just add to the organic matter of the soil too.
Do you have any recommendations for trellises for bush style cucumbers and if self-watering pots?
I personally haven't used any self-watering pots, but I would say, as far as the bush, there's bush beans don't need a support, but if you're going to use a pole bean, then you would want to have some sort of trellis for it to climb on. So I would say, I mean, you could use bamboo sticks. You could use, you know, a regular trellis support for that as well. Either one of those would be an effective use. I mean, I've even seen people use like tomato cages for their beans to crawl up on too. So just anything like that for it to climb on. But for bush beans, they won't need a support. The pole beans will though.
Have you ever used a kiddie pool as a garden bed?
I have not. Again, I would be concerned a little bit with the drainage. There's nowhere for the water to go. So if you were going to use something like that, you would want to make sure that, you know, you had good drainage on the bottom, whether it's cutting out the bottom or providing drain holes.
And then mint, cilantro, and bell peppers in containers. I would say mint is a container must because it can run away from you and get all over your garden.
Yeah, mint can be very invasive. So keeping those contained would be definitely advisable.
And then Rachel had some success with bell peppers in a container, so it's possible.
Yeah.
And then Zen had a question about the labeling of the determinant in our store and on our plant search online and in our plant guide printed version. Everything is labeled if it's determinate or indeterminate when you're in store here. Let me see. Sorry, I am scanning the questions right now. Can you do a little more explanation on determinate versus indeterminate tomatoes as far as harvest times and how, like, which one produces once and which one produces over longer periods? Yeah,
so the indeterminate is where you're going to get a longer harvest period. The determinate, it tends to kind of stop after a certain point. A lot of times, you know, I've seen even people use the indeterminate variety as, you know, kind of if they have like an arched trellis, you can even train it to go over the arched trellis as a support, almost more like a vining type plant because they do get so tall.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, but I'm gonna move on and then I will be sure to touch base with them a little bit later.
Okay. So I just wanted to touch on a little bit on how you can extend the season with various supplies. So like making cold frames and hoop houses can help protect some plants from extreme cold and extend the growing season into the colder months. So like things like your lettuces, things that are the early spring and late fall, you can even extend that farther by providing this extra protection and, you know, get more out of your garden that way. Shade cloths and screens are also really useful, especially for the cooler loving plants like lettuces, because it can protect them from the hotter parts of the day. Once it gets too hot, those lettuces, they will bolt, meaning they'll produce a flower, and that's kind of the end of their growing season. So a way to kind of deter that is to protect them with a shade cloth and from those warmer temps. Another way to extend the season is by using succession planting. So this is kind of like, there's two different ways you could think of succession planting. You could either use with the same vegetable, planting it staggered weeks throughout. So something like radishes, you could plant one row 1 week, and then, you know, the next week plant it another row and then another row. And then that way you're constantly harvesting at different times, and you're getting more from that section of, and you're getting more radishes than if you just planted everything at once. Another way to think about it too is you could plant a different plant. If you have something that's a cold, loving plant like, or, short season plant like radishes or lettuce, you could have that area with the lettuce and radishes. And then once that's done, then you could plant your tomatoes and your peppers in that spot, because you won't be utilizing that spot because you've already harvested what you could get from that part of the season. And you can be creative with how you make these cold frames. I've seen them made from like old windows and doors. So there's lots of different options for that. You just want to make sure that you've got, if you're going to do something like a hoop house, you'll need some sort of like PVC piping or something to support it, so that it doesn't collapse on itself. And then one thing I also really recommend is keeping a garden journal. This is a great way to, one, stay organized. You can reference it from, year to year. You can track when you started seeds or when you planted outdoors. You can record things that did well and ideas for next year. It allows you to, remember where you planted everything so that you can maybe rotate things around. That also helps, with the health of the soil by changing where your plants are so that it's not depleting the same nutrients over and over again in that same spot. And you can get, if you're a creative person, you can really get, I've seen some really beautiful garden journals out there. So with, you can cut out pictures and things, like however crafty you want to get it or however simple you want to go. It's just a great reference tool to just stay organized, because there's a lot of things to kind of keep track of and things that you can reference then for next year.
Okay, I have a couple of questions I'm going to throw at you.
Okay.
There were some questions in the chat about pests and how to deter some pests, specifically Japanese beetles, but it's a broad topic.
Yeah, Japanese beetles are tough. Really the only way that I've found is just picking them off and putting them in a cup of soapy water. But I know a lot of times, with some of those other pests, the fragrant herbs, or even like onions, are great to plant next to things like cabbages, because they have a tendency to deter those like white little moths that you see fluttering around your cabbages. And any kind of herbal, like strong herbal plants like thyme and oregano, things like that. And intermixing those things throughout. And when you're intermixing things, there's all different types of scents that are being put out. And it's a way to actually deter pests by intermixing things together, so that they're not, if you have everything all kind of grouped together, it's like, oh, we can have a field day with all of these vegetables that we love to go after. By intermixing it kind of helps deter those pests naturally.
Oh, my other thought on like Japanese beetles is, if you use the traps, you don't put them near the plants that they like. You put them as far away from the plants that they like as possible, because the traps attract the beetles.
Yes.
And then as far as other kind of pests in the garden, it's helpful to know if you take a picture of what's bothering your plant. You could bring it in and show us, and we can help diagnose it. It's a little, we do not recommend really any chemical solutions at all. So it's helpful to have the information of what's actually on your plant to help you diagnose it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any tips to help prevent blossom end rot on your tomatoes?
Well, I would say a lot of times blossom end rot, we had a lot of issues last year, I think, with a lot of blossom end rot. And I think a lot of it has to do with inconsistent watering. So, you know, especially we had some like really hot days. And so with tomatoes, you know, you want to make sure, number one, actually, this is really good with any plant. You want to water early, you know, water early in the morning, if possible. You know, if you're watering midday when it's hot out, a lot of that water is going to evaporate into the air and it won't get a chance to soak down into the roots where it's needed. So I would say definitely water at the beginning of the day. And then if it's looking wilty after the, you know, hottest part of the day, in the evening, water it again, because water is what is bringing the nutrients through the plant. And if there's not enough water, it's not going to get those nutrients, and that's what causes the blossom end rot. I mean, you can always use the tomato tone, which has the extra calcium in it, but if you've already added that, if you're already using that, then I wouldn't say that adding more to it is going to prevent, you know, that from happening. It really has to do with the watering and getting those nutrients to the plant.
Do you have any tips to keep like critters out? Rabbits,
like rabbits.
Squirrels,
Rabbits are the bane of a gardener's existence. I mean, again, you know, having a raised bed, it helps. That is sometimes a deterrent. But, you know, a lot of times you're just going to have to create, you know, like some sort of fencing around it, you know, like with hardware cloth or chicken wire. That's probably going to be the most effective way to keep, you know, at least things like rabbits and ground squirrels. You know, tree squirrels can be a problem too. But a lot of times more of their destruction is just digging up, you know, your seeds that you planted or, you know, that kind of thing.
Cindy also recommended like chili powder or spicy spices, which is, it could work too. And we also do have a spray. It does wash off in the rain though, so you will be reapplying, and they tend to get used to it after a while. So you have to keep switching up your product.
No, you don't talk.
Yeah, I think the main thing is with deterring pests is just every day take a look about what's going on in the garden. If you can catch something early in the egg stage, then you're going to be in much better shape than if you've waited because you're not checking for things. I think just checking every day is probably the best way to stay on top of things before it gets out of control.
Neem oil, that is safe, correct?
Yeah, it is one of the more organic products that you can use.
Squash vine borers, do you have any advice to deter those guys?
I would say a lot of times it's, if you've had it in the same spot year after year, change the location, because they do, I think, tend to overwinter in the soil. But if it's something new, I would say one thing you could do is, you know, you want to, maybe you could put like a cup, you know, like some sort of cup around the base of the plant, to prevent them, you know, from getting in early on.
Yeah, so you would cut out the bottom of the cup and wrap it around the stem, correct?
And put it around the base of the plant when it's young, you know, start that early.
And then do you have any tips to get rid of mold or fungus on your cucumbers or anything?
A lot of times that has to do with airflow. So, you know, you'd want to make sure if it's, make sure that you're spacing plants out well enough, make sure that the cucumbers have something to climb up on. As far as in the soil while something's planted, I don't know, do you have anything that you could recommend? I can't think of anything. I think a lot of times it has to do with airflow. Like, so I would say, you know, making sure to prevent it from the beginning, make sure that there's just, you have enough space between plants. If you're doing, I would maybe if you need to take out that top layer of soil and start with something, you know, start fresh. That might be something that you could do before the growing season starts, if it's something that's reoccurring.
Yeah. Question about ants in a raised bed, getting rid of them.
So ants aren't bad necessarily. If they've really taken over, you know, they can kind of be harbors for aphids, but as long as they're not totally taken over the bed, I would say just let them be. Getting rid of them though is tricky because if you get rid of one spot, they tend to just find another spot to go. I mean, as long as you don't have like a lot, if you don't have plants in there right now, I've heard using like hot boiling water to try to get them out of there. It sometimes might be just trying to, I mean, you can put traps outside, but you know, I'm always leery of, you know, doing things like that because you don't want to also affect the other, you know, other things that are out there too that are beneficial. Like I know, you know, diatomaceous earth is something that a lot of people recommend, but the problem with that is that can also harm beneficial insects too. So I typically don't recommend things like that because it's not specific to just the pest that you don't want.
True. A couple of questions about hornworms and other caterpillars on different vegetables. Mm-hmm. And again, this is the Japanese beetle method of plucking them off when you see them.
Yeah. I mean, and again, look on the undersides of the leaves. You want to look, if you can, again, catch it early, look for the eggs. If you're finding the eggs, get rid of those before it you know, they evolve and get to a bigger problem of eating your plant. You know, some things you can do in the early spring is, you know, you can kind of put netting over, you know, those cabbage plants to kind of prevent the, you know, those cabbage moths from laying the eggs on your plant. But I think probably the most effective way is, again, yeah, if you see one, I mean, they're green, like the cabbage worms are green and tomato hornworms are green, they blend in. So you really have to be looking for them and just plucking them off as you see them.
Okay, I have a question about tomatoes in containers and not getting a very healthy harvest out of it. One of my suggestions would be that inconsistent watering or maybe needing more nutrients.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if it's in a container, just make sure it's not drying out too quickly. And then again, adding nutrients to the soil to help feed the plant. Typically, again, if you go back to that NPK formula, it's the phosphorus that's going to produce the flowers and the buds. So that phosphorus is an important key. So maybe, you know, if it's a little bit low in phosphorus, then maybe you'd want to add more of that to help boost the production of the flowers. And if it's got too much nitrogen, that could be creating too much foliage and not enough flowers. So you could be having too much nitrogen, but not enough phosphorus. So just think about that balance in the soil when if you're looking to fertilize, you know, if that's the issue that you're having.
Thanks, Sandy. We had some seed starting questions, but I'm gonna have you go through your seed starting section and then we'll get to those questions.
Okay. So, so with starting seeds indoors, you're going to want to use a dark, warm location to get them started. They don't need light when they're still in the soil, but as soon as a seedling emerges, that's when you're going to want to expose them to light. So typically, so like I know some of you may have gotten these kits from the Growing Place. And so maybe we can kind of go over this first, and then we can get into some of the details about growing them. But the seeds that you guys received, you know, I kind of divided them up into which ones need to be transplanted and which ones can be sown directly. So the ones that you're going to need to start indoors, they all say this on the back, it's going to be all of your tomatoes and your pepper plants. The ones that won't need to be sown indoors are like your bush beans, your zucchini, the squashes and pumpkins, the cucumber, nasturtium, and the lettuces. Those all can be sown directly outdoors. But again, it's going to be varying times that you're going to want to do that. But as far as indoor, it's the peppers and tomatoes that we'd want to start indoors. And so for these, I think you guys were all provided with soil, and you're going to want to start with the soil damp because once they're planted, because they are smaller seeds, you don't want to disturb them by watering them after you've planted them. So if the soil is nice and wet before you get started, that's probably the best route to take. Now you can, with these seeds, you can, to speed up the germination process, you could soak your seeds. I would say if you do this, make sure that you use, you know, hot but not boiling water, and don't soak them for more than 12 hours because you don't want to waterlog them either. But a lot of times soaking the seeds will help speed up the germination process. But you definitely want to have your tray in a dark, warm location because a lot of these seeds, because they are warm-loving plants, they're going to want the soil to be a warm temperature. Sometimes I've even seen, you know, your refrigerator, if you have space on top of your refrigerator, that, you know, engine is running, so that tends to be a warm spot. That's a good place to do that. And you should have enough seeds in each of these packets to plant at least 2, maybe 3 seeds in a cell. So I mean, the way that I have mine set up is I kind of, you know, I'm gonna plant, maybe, like I would plant a row of this type and a row of this type, and I could do a row of each of the types of seeds that we have. Now, if you want to plant more of one kind versus the other, then you could certainly do that. But this was kind of how I set mine up to plant the seeds. And because these seeds are they're pretty small, I would say you don't want to plant them deeper than maybe 1/4 of an inch into the soil, because you don't want to plant them too deep that they're going to have to really struggle to reach the top. So what I would do is, once the soil is damp, you can you can take a couple of the seeds. See, they're really, really tiny, and I just kind of push the soil aside, and then I'm going to put, can you guys see that? 1, 2, 3 seeds in, and then I'm just going to kind of cover the soil up like that. And then you can go through and do that with each of the cells, and then you've got these little plant labels that you can write down the variety of plant that you planted there. And then I always find, unless you're using a journal too, it's also helpful to write the date that you planted it to, because it helps you remember when you planted it, because especially when it comes to the date of maturity, you're kind of tracking, and you know when you need to transplant it, and then when you can expect to find, start seeing fruit on the plant as well. So once you have all of your cells planted and labeled, then you can take this. You also received a plastic dome. This kind of creates a greenhouse effect. So you've got the heat, and you've got the plastic dome to kind of keep the moisture in, and it will help create the ideal conditions for your seeds to germinate. And then as soon as you start to see a sprout come up, you're going to want to take this off, and you're going to want to expose those seedlings to light. And it's important that the light is 1 to 2 inches above the seedling. You don't want it touching the seedling, but a lot of times when people are starting seeds indoors, they put them next to a window, which can be, it can be colder by the window, but also they will reach for the light, and they can tend to get really leggy. If you see like really, really long, legs on the plant, it's because they're not close enough to the light. And so what you want to do is you can use like a shop light or a clamp, and just with any kind of like a fluorescent or an LED bulb is probably the best. You'll get a bright white light that will imitate the sun. And because these seedlings, when they're young, they need 14 to 16 hours of direct sunlight. So that's even more than the daylight we get in the early days of spring here. So it's really important. I think most people find problems with their seedlings is because they're not getting enough light. And so it's important to have that light really close to the seedlings to help them create so that they don't get leggy. And then, with the, some of these seeds are quite large. So like, here's an example of the squash seed. Because they are much bigger, they can be planted deeper. When you plant them in the garden, these you could plant, to like 1 inch into the soil. And so the ones that you would plant later in the season, like these are more of the heat-loving plants, would be like the squashes, the beans, the cucumbers, and the pumpkin. The ones that you could plant early on in the season would be like your kale and your lettuce. So one of the seeds, so you've got like this Bambi lettuce seed. These have quite, they're a coated shell. So in order to help with the germination process, there's something called scarification that you can do. And it's basically like you can just rub the seed coat on sandpaper, or you can even nick it with a knife or tap it with a hammer. And this will help the germination process for these particular seeds. And then, and these, because like these are a little bit bigger, you could probably do those at like a 1/2 inch deep. Same with like the nasturtium and the cucumber. Those they're a little bit bigger. You could do those at maybe a 1/2 inch. And same with like the Malabar spinach, which these are great because spinach tends to bolt early in the season, but this is a type of spinach that loves the heat. So that's one that you'll have all season. So that's kind of nice.
It also has pretty purple stems.
Yes.
And well, you want to eat the baby leaves because the older leaves are a little more bitter on that one.
Yeah. And then I would say is there any questions specifically to the seeds that you have or with your setup that I can answer?
There was a question about grow light recommendations, wattage. I don't know if you would know the answer to that.
I mean, I think the main thing is you want to don't use like a soft white bulb. Using LED or fluorescent light is going to provide that bright white light to simulate the sun. There are kits and things like you can buy pre-made things, but even if you just got a clamp light and or like a shop light, hanging that over your setup, I think that would be sufficient.
And then if you have your seedlings up already and either got some mold on it, do you have any tips short of retransplanting into a different container?
Well, so again, that probably has to do with airflow. So if you have like a fan kind of blowing in, in that area, that would help to help prevent the mold from happening. You can, I mean, if it's not bad, you can, it's probably fine. But catching it early on and using a fan can help prevent mold from and fungus and stuff developing in the soil.
We had a question about what soilless medium is, and it's just basically a lightweight potting mix. It's not topsoil. Our container mix is a soilless mix. Any of the seed starting mixes that you would find are soilless mixes. It's different organic materials that are not topsoil.
Yeah, you want something that's kind of a light, airy mix for your seed starting, just so that they're not having to work so hard to push through to get to the top of the soil.
And then there's a question about holes in the dome for air circulation and when to take off the plastic cover.
Okay, so this is you won't need, I mean, you're going to take it off obviously when you need to, if the soil is starting to dry out. But honestly, this is a nice way to kind of keep all that moisture in. So hopefully you won't have to be really watering that much while this is on. But if you leave this on and the seedlings are coming up, you're you're preventing oxygen now from getting to that plant. So as soon as you see the first seedling, that's when you want to take this off, because you don't need, it doesn't need, it's getting for the seed to germinate, it's getting everything it needs from under the soil. As soon as it starts to emerge from the soil is when you need oxygen for that plant, you know, to survive. So taking it off as soon as you see the first seedling is going to be helping that plant to grow. And then I guess I should also mention, you know, these trays do have drainage holes at the bottom. So just wherever you are putting it for watering, make sure you have something underneath to protect it, to protect the surface that it's sitting on.
So Belle also mentioned that she puts seeds in a moist paper towel and a plastic bag on the floor by the heater until it germinates and then plants it. It's a different method of starting.
Yeah.
And is it better to have it by the window or under a grow light?
I would say, you know, when they're starting out, it's definitely, you're better off with a grow light because we don't get enough sunlight during the day. And most homes, you know, you're going to have parts of the day where you're not getting direct sunlight to those plants. So having a grow light is going to give you the best results as far as your seed development and growth. And then just constantly, you know, you're going to have to adjust that light as the plant grows. Once the seedlings have developed at least 2 or 4 of their true leaves, that's when you're going to want to transplant them. You're going to want to thin back because you've got 3 plants now. If you've planted 3 seeds in each cell, the reason we do that is not because we're going to get more plants, but it's because not all seeds will germinate. And so this is ensuring that you're going to at least get 1 or 2 seeds to germinate in each cell. So you'll want to thin back, which means you're going to want to, you know, you can use a pair of scissors or just your fingers to just cut off the tops of the other 2 plants and allow that 1 plant in that cell to grow. So usually, you know, the way I choose, I know people have a hard time like, oh, I don't want to cut that, but actually it's going to be better for the plant if it's got its own cell to grow in. And then once it's got about a couple inches tall, you can transplant that into another container. Because you'll, like, I think at, you know, the dollar store, they've got little like 3-inch pots, or I've seen solo cups, things like that. With the solo cups, again, you just want to make sure that you've got a drainage hole in the bottom of it so that it has a place for the water to go.
I have a question about if your seeds haven't sprouted yet, do you remove the ones that have? Or there is a germination rate, so some might not germinate.
Yeah, I mean, different seeds will germinate at different times. You know, some might take, you know, 5 to 10 days. Some might take 7 to 14 days. So, you know, depending on the variety, it might have a different rate to germinate. But even if the other seeds have not germinated, but, you know, some of them have, you're still going to want to take it off so that the ones that have germinated have the best chance of, you know, the best chance of growing healthy. You don't want to leave the dome on until all of them have sprouted, because the ones that sprouted earlier are going to they're not going to be as happy underneath that dome.
We also had some questions about hardening off, so I'm going to share my screen again and pull that slide up.
Yeah. Yeah, so hardening off is kind of the process of allowing these plants that have been nice and protected and warm and happy indoors and getting them used to the outdoors. So usually about, I would say, a week before you are planning on transplanting them into your garden, you want to gradually increase the amount of time that the seedlings are left outdoors each day, because they're going to need to get used to that direct sunlight, the wind, the fluctuating temperatures. And if your seedlings have not had a chance to acclimate to that weather, they're going to kind of go into transplant shock, or they could get sunburned if they haven't been acclimated to that direct sunlight from outdoors. So this is definitely a process that is needed when you are starting seeds indoors, and you just have to plan accordingly. So to gradually start out with 1 hour and then increase it to 2 and then maybe 4. And then, by the end of the week, it's been outside all day, and now the weekend you can plant and they'll be happy in their new home.
Would you recommend getting soil tested before putting your plants outside?
If you're planting in the ground, if you're doing it more of a traditional garden, then I would say, yes, you should know what is in your soil before you plant. I think that way, especially if there are any toxins in the soil, you don't want to be planting your vegetables in there, but you also want to know, are there minerals, or nutrients that are depleted that I have to make sure I add to the soil in order for my plants to be happy.
Right. Does anybody have any other questions? No? Oh, I got another question. Does the putting a fan on the plants help?
I mean, it definitely helps with airflow when you have them indoors. It can help create a more sturdy seedling in general when, transplanting outdoors. But again, that I wouldn't say that using a fan in lieu of hardening off is a solution, but it's more for preventing mold in the soil and keeping the airflow around the plants.
I did have a question about best soil for indoors and outdoors. I know we covered that pretty in depth at the beginning of the presentation. So if you missed it, we will have it posted on the YouTube, on our YouTube page, the recording.
Yeah, I mean, when you transplant, you can just add, you can use a potting soil mix when you're transplanting into a larger container for your seedlings. At that point, the seeds have emerged. So if it's a little bit of a heavier soil, then that's okay. It's just, you want this kind of lightweight soil for the seed starting portion.
Do you have a favorite resource for succession planting, specifically when you go from early season to summer veggies? Like if a carrot takes 70 to 80 days and you sow April 1st, when would it be ready for tomatoes?
Well, so carrots carrots take a really long time to grow. So I wouldn't necessarily use carrots as something. I would actually use carrots planted alongside tomatoes, or at least leave a space for tomatoes. They tend to complement each other as far as they tend to add flavor to your tomatoes. They also benefit from the shade. The root crops tend to like to have a little bit of shade during the day. So having them next to tomatoes is a great way for them to kind of provide that as well. I would say you want to look at the time to maturity of the seeds that you're looking at buying. So like radishes are probably one of the fastest growing plants. And so that's a great succession plant to use. And I would say your lettuces, those are short, they don't like the hot weather. So kind of once you get to the summer, when the tomatoes are ready to come out, the lettuces are kind of done. And so I would say those two types of plants are great for succession planting. Sometimes, if you, for the fall, you could be, if you really want to get into seed starting, you could be starting, some of those like cabbages and things like that for the fall, so that when the tomatoes are done, then you can put cabbages in, or put more of the lettuces in after that.
I had a question about purple cauliflower, and I did not see the seeds right next to me, but I also have the seed savers are not in this room with me, so I have to double check. I know I have white cauliflower plants for sale in the season, and I have white cauliflower seeds with the Renee's garden. But if you give us a call, we can find out for you about the purple cauliflower. Question about treated lumber for a raised garden bed, and if it's a good idea or not.
So I typically don't recommend using treated lumber, only because you don't want chemicals being leached into the soil. Cedar, although it's expensive, it is naturally rot resistant and pest resistant. So that's a good option if you're looking at lumber. There's lots of like metal, troughed looking type beds that you can use. I've even seen, if you're looking for something more temporary, people have used like straw bales, and then they filled the center with soil. I mean, you probably would only get maybe two seasons out of it, because it will start to decompose. But if you're wanting something just temporary to try it out, then that might be a good option too. But yeah, using like treated lumber or like the railroad ties, that have lots of chemicals, I would not recommend for, vegetable gardening, since you're going to be eating, the things that come out of that.
Can you transplant from the smaller cells into the larger ones before planting outside, or should you do that? Bump it up from
you're going to want, because you're going to want to, again, this is with the airflow and room to grow, you're going to want to allow, that plant to, you don't want to crowd out the other plants. So giving it a larger container gives it more space to grow, helps with the root development. And I would definitely recommend, planting them up to a bigger size pot before putting them outside.
Do you have any tips for Brussels sprouts?
Brussels sprouts take a really long time to grow. So you plant them early in the spring and you don't get a harvest until the fall. So, I think they're a really cool plant to grow. Again, it's part of the cabbage family. So you're constantly going to be battling with those cabbage moths, just keeping an eye on them throughout the season. But yeah, they take a really long time to grow. So a lot of people don't realize that, but they are a fall harvest plant, but you have to start them early.
Question about the lid on the tray. Once you take out the germinated seeds, would you put the lid back on for the rest of the seeds?
No, I would say leave it off as soon as the first seed germinates and you see it coming through the soil, take the lid off.
And for the seed starting, watering from the bottom versus watering from the top.
Yeah, so if you have this tray, if you have like one of those like aluminum roasting pan type things that you can, buy, you can certainly fill the bottom of that tray, and because it has, you know, the holes in the bottom, you can certainly water from the bottom. That definitely helps with root development. It also prevents you from overwatering.
And then for in the garden or growing in grow bags, I think they're a great thing for many types of vegetables. Do you have any specific ones you like to use the grow bags for?
I mean, I've used like for potatoes. I mean, I always try to include potatoes. Like my kids love digging up potatoes in the soil. So I love doing potatoes in the grow bags. You know, it's a way to kind of like keep it separate from other things too, because you are digging a lot of soil up to get to them, and it prevents you from like missing a potato, you know, like that happened to me before where I did it in my garden, and like the next season I'm like, oh, look it, there's a sprout coming out. It's like a potato that I left in there all winter and it was starting to sprout again. So yeah, I think they're great for tomatoes. I mean, especially if you just have a small space, and you know, you can use lots of containers for and then what's nice about the grow bags is that they're kind of compact and you can store them away easily for the winter when you're not, you know, gardening.
Actually, I just had a couple of people tell me they're in Michigan and New York, which is fun. I would caution that you check your local frost dates and different dates for your area, because we are in zone 5 in Illinois with lots of heavy clay soil. So some of our recommendations are specific to this area. A question about using manure for fertilizer. We actually do sell the mushroom compost, but it's blended, it's cut with topsoil, so it is not a full strength. And yes, it can burn your plants if you use too much.
Yeah, and I would say you want to put that in, like, you almost want to do that like if you're using like pure manure, you want to probably do that at the end of the season, and mix that in just so that it's not gonna affect your plants when you go to plant it. Give it time to kind of break down into the soil.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Sandy, you are a wealth of information. We look forward to seeing you. We officially open for the season on April 1st. Our spring hours are 10 to 5, 7 days a week. So we will be here 7 days a week, 10 to 5, and we will see you in 6 days. Have a good weekend, everybody.